All right, you guys, so excited to have you both. Are we ready to rock?
Buenos dias.
Hola, buenos días.
And we are live, ladies.
Yay.
Hello,
Buenos
world.
días todos.
So excited to have you both. I just want to make sure we're good, and it looks like we are. This is the benefit of live stream. All right, we are live. Welcome to Contextualize This. I am your host, Viviana Vigil. You know, these days, the headlines are sometimes dividing us, very divisive times. But by looking through the lens of historical context, sometimes we can better clearly define the issues and maybe even resolve them. Today, we're going to be talking about street vendors and the concept of abolitionist marketplaces. You know, there has been a rise in violence against street vendors. There's been a push towards decriminalization after human rights activists stepped up to protect these workers who are primarily women, undocumented, elderly, and disabled. I'm joined today by my co-host, community activist, Adriana Vigil, and our expert, Dr. Leigh-Anna Hidalgo, who is assistant professor of sociology at SUNY's Binghamton University. Welcome, ladies.
Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
And full disclosure, Adriana Vigil is indeed my sister. And she has some history with Dr. Hidalgo as well. You guys studied together, is that true?
Yes.
Yes.
And we met, and I was like, I love this woman forever. It's a wonderful
Same.
soul. Pleasure to be around, and I think we met dance. I don't know why. Always I go back.
Well, let's
to
not
the
get
moment
into
I
that
danced.
let's not get into the dancing too much. We have a lot to cover today. Our community activist is, of course, out in the community at the beach. How wonderful. You know, Dr. Hidalgo, you have studied street vendors for several years. You've coined the term abolitionist marketplaces to describe the economy in which they operate. I want to get into that a little bit more in detail in just a bit, but let's start with the history of street vending, which I imagine has been around since humans began bartering. I remember a time when food trucks were dirty roach coaches, and now they're chic, you know, food trucks. People get their weddings catered by them. What changed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, first, I really want to say that there's been so many incredible Latino scholars that really made this a field that I could be in and something that I could study. So I really want to thank Alfonso Morales, Emir Estrada, Lorena Munoz, Rocio Rosales, all these amazing scholars who have been studying this and allowed me then to also say, I'm going to be a street vendor scholar. So really building on their work. And in terms of thinking about street vending as something historical, I think it's really important because a lot of the literature suggests that this is something new, that it really grew in the 1970s with the surge of Latino immigration to the US. But, you know, I think if we look at this through a historical lens, and Mark Valliantos has, he tells us, you know, in 1910 and 1913, there were tamalero vendors who were criminalized and were getting thrown in jail, and they were mobilizing. And this was happening in downtown LA. And before them, there were Chinese vegetable workers who were also being thrown in jail. In fact, one of the first anti-peddler laws around the turn of the century was targeting Chinese vegetable vendors. So this has always been a way that people in marginalized communities have moved in the world. A lot of times, you know, capitalism uses and discards our bodies. And so we're left to pick up the pieces and try to make something of that. And so a lot of people we see are in that pattern. And a lot of times it has to do with the economy. And it has to do with the way that regulations change. So for instance, there are times when we want migration, and there are times when we try to criminalize it, right? And so there's these ebbs and flows, and street vending and the street vending economy is very much a part of that.
Yeah,
that's an interesting point, because when we think of the economy, how it started doing better after, 2010, I just know after the downfall, that's when really we started seeing these kind of chic street vendors coming out. You know what I mean? Like the last 10 years are what that I remember, like seeing them more with their fancy trucks and fusion foods and celebrating diversity, celebrating our immigrant past or whatever. So that's an interesting point.
As a reaction to the recession. Yeah, they needed to come
Yeah.
in. And so, you know, that's interesting because in some of the history that I've seen too, here in Los Angeles, we have a fancy place called Grand Central Market that's been around for a long time. And reading an article that was for, it was a city subsidized marketplace that was for white vendors. And non-white vendors were not allowed there. And so that's why they were kind of forced into the streets, knocking on doors, selling their tamales, et cetera, et cetera. And then eventually in the 1930s, tacos here in Los Angeles, which of course have stayed true. And I know, Adriana, I know you had some fun anecdotal stories about the Chinese vendors and also you had talked about how much on the move some of these vendors are, like when you've gone to the Staples Center and, you know, you see them selling the hot dogs out front.
Well, first when Leigh-Anna started, and I'm calling her Leigh-Anna because I have a personal relationship before doctor, but she's always doctor now. She's doctor forever now. But when Leigh-Anna mentioned tamale vendors, I just go right away to, you know, my abuelita and a lot of our viewers and people in LA, and I'm sure outside of LA, can remember when our abuelitos, our parents, us were forced when you're a kid and forced to sell the tamales or forced to participate in the swap meets or we enjoyed it. But it's always a story in our family where my abuelita talks about how she made our abuelito sell tamales because she was making them, so she'd send him out. Oh, sorry, an earpod. I lost an earpod. And we would joke because she'd say, yeah, everyone, when they would see him, they'd call him, the tamale man's coming. So then it was like a joke in the house because then it was like, Abuelito, the tamale man's coming when he'd enter the room. And it just shows how much that's ingrained in maybe our culture, maybe just our family identities. But I feel like a lot of people that resonates with a lot of people, those memories and those experiences. But with Chinese street vendors, it really is just, it rings true to how immigrants in this country, when we first arrived, I'm not gonna say we, but when immigrants first arrived, there's always this whole idea of unsanitary conditions. They're unsanitary, they're unclean, they're, you know, that other, you know, and that just always seems to ring true when they want to dehumanize and otherize these new flows of people that are coming in, new cultures. And I feel like that's what happened with the Chinese vendors, like you're saying, that were criminalized for selling produce because there was not fresh produce in their area, kind of similar to what we have now with our food deserts in certain communities. Yet they're going to get barred from selling fresh produce at the same time. And it's like, culturally, it was probably specific of certain vegetables that maybe they used. And also just to have fresh produce. It was something that they knew to be healthy and part of their customs and tradition and health, you know? So it's just interesting how we have this flawed concept of pulling ourselves up by the bootstraps when, you know, the boots are stripped off of us, or, you know, you just have a chancla to try to make it work. And I know, Vivi, you mentioned, there was some quote that you mentioned about that.
I forgot, what was it?
It was that we don't even have boots to pull up.
Oh yeah, that was Martin Luther King's quote. He says that they want us to pull us up from our bootstraps. We don't even have boots. Yeah.
And that's such an example of how your boots are taken
Which
away.
It's so interesting because this is like the American way, right? Is like do it yourself, and then when you have people doing it themselves, then they're penalized, then they're criminalized, then they're, you know. And it is amazing that these traditions have withstood the test of time. I was just in Chinatown a couple of days ago. They're still selling their vegetables on the corner, and I was like, oh my God, this is where you get the small bok choys. You know, where you want to get the bok choy, they're giant at the. They had the tiny ones. I was like, I need to come here and get the small bok choys. They know where to get their stuff, you know, and it's still that tradition. We lost Adriana. She's, you know, she's on vacation. So it's still that tradition of carrying on that street vendor mentality. And, you know, there's really the hustler mentality that immigrants often have to deal with when they come into this country.
Yeah, and you know, Adriana was talking about, you know, Natalia Molina, and it just makes me think about, you know, something important that I think she does in her work is that she's linking across race and looking at the way that certain laws and policies then get repackaged for other groups, right? And so we're linked historically through time, through laws and policies. And so when you're mentioning, Adriana, the Chinese, you know, vendors who were the first, you know, to be criminalized, also think about also the first anti-immigrant laws.
Right. Which is at the same time.
Around the same time. So these laws are all linked. And, you know, it's a way of making life so unbearable. It's a strategy of making life so unbearable and so difficult that you'll leave, right? And so it happened with the Chinese, and it's happened to Latinos, and, you know, it's happening to Black folks, has been happening to Black folks. And so, you know, Jim Crow was a part of this, of making life so difficult, of restricting and marginalizing so much that there was literally no kinds of work that you can do. And so the informal economy is at play again. So yeah, I think that looking at the laws and policies and how they're linked, and they're linked through time, and they're linked through other groups, is really critical.
It's also really funny to me that no matter how hard they've tried over the decades, they can't get rid of them. Why? Because people love Mexican food. They love street food.
Yeah.
They love
Chinese
tacos. They love, well,
like
the Chinese food has
emblematic of America now. And tacos. It became American food.
And culturally, you know, through our generations, we're comfortable buying produce off of a truck that honks and does the little la cucaracha horn. You know, we run out there, we get up our we're comfortable with that. I remember I stopped to pick up some oranges one time. You know, I always try to support street vendors because I see them out there hustling in the sun, sometimes with their kids. So I pulled over just to get a bag of oranges. The cops pulled up behind me to shut him down. And then he came and told me, you know, this is illegal, right? You know, they're not supposed to be doing this. And I was like, oh, I didn't know that. But, you know, it's like, why are they penalizing these people? It kind of brings to this next thing, the criminalization of street vending. Why? You know, you've described it as a racket. Why is it a racket? Is it the fines? Is it the arrests? You know, they've been trying to legalize it, but then that legalization process is a racket too.
Right. So, so in 1994 is when it became a misdemeanor to street vend. So that's really the period that I'm looking at, that my work focuses on, is the period of 1994 to 2018, which is when this ordinance, this city law was in place that made it a misdemeanor. And so, you know, again, thinking about history, what's happening in 1994, we have that anti-immigrant law coming into place. We have a war on poverty that's happening. We have the war on drugs. You know, all these things are happening at the same time. And so finding ways to criminalize, target, police, and arrest poor people of color is very much what's happening really across the nation. But this is another one of those laws that makes it possible to see someone who is really just selling a sweet potato pie or selling a taco and arrest them, handcuff them, throw them in jail. And so that was what happened during this 30-year period of time. And I think that what's really important, and what I'm trying to do in my work, is in, you know, doing ethnography and working with a small group of people for years, for 6 years, is really show, okay, it's not just about that arrest. Because I think that what you will see a lot of times now, we have YouTube and we have people documenting these arrests, you see it as this interaction between a police and a street vendor, and that's it. You don't know what happens after and how they become entangled in all these different situations that have to do with the state. So thinking about, well, you mentioned that they have children with them. So what happens to the child? when the parent is arrested. Well, that child ends up in the foster care system.
Right.
And through interviews, these kinds of stories have come out. And so when you look at 30 years of legal violence like this, using the term coined by Cecilia Menjivar and Leigh Abrego, legal violence laws that make this kind of violence lawful. You have mothers who lost their children for a period of time because of street vending. You have people getting deported. You have people going to jail for long periods of time who can't afford to get out. And so the kinds of devastation that happens. And then you have people becoming unhoused, because what happens, if we read about the criminal justice system, what happens when you go to jail? There's a whole cycle of poverty that happens afterwards. So then you have people living in their cars and becoming unhoused. And those kinds of stories are very important to tell. And those are the kinds of stories that you don't get from a YouTube video when you're seeing a cop come and arrest someone.
I didn't even think about that. I assumed it was like a fine. I've seen them confiscate their equipment, which is really horrible because I know how expensive it can be. But I didn't realize that it had these sort of slippery slope snowball effects, which makes sense, because if you have a fine, you can't pay it, all of a sudden it's doubled, next thing you know. And to think that somebody would lose their children for just trying to make a living is unconscionable. I mean, I can't even imagine. Let me show you guys a video. And I know you've seen some of this stuff before with street vendors. Let me know if you can see it. Let me play it for you. So here we have somebody that's come over and knocked the fruit cart completely over, breaking it, damaging all the products.
Crazy.
This is a guy, I don't know who he is in the community. Supposedly she wasn't paying the street tax that she needs to pay. You know what I mean? Obviously they are very angry. The community has really stepped up to support a lot of these vendors. Oops, stop sharing. Okay, good. But it's ugly. It's ugly to see that. So we see that legal violence you're talking about now sort of giving other people carte blanche to be violent towards these street vendors. What is your reaction when you see some of these videos?
Yeah, I mean, it's really disheartening. It's so sad to see, when people in our community do that to other people in our community. It just really speaks to what legal violence allows, and so when you make somebody a scapegoat, and that's the other thing, is that there's so many lies. There's this public discourse about street vendors, that they're greedy, that they're benefiting from not paying taxes, so there's this whole entire rhetoric that's created about them that's false. Studies have shown the opposite, quite the opposite. Street vendors prevent crime. Street vendors keep sidewalks clean. Street vendors attract more pedestrians, more foot traffic. And so all stores are benefiting from this, right? So even no matter how many studies have come out to show this and confirm this, there's this rhetoric that is created, right? That really upholds the criminalization, right? And these unjust laws. And so there's other people in our community who are also being criminalized themselves, but they see, a person who's marginalized, and, it's unfortunate that it happens, but it's really just that we allow these laws, that this rhetoric is created, and these untruths, right? But it is very encouraging when you see people really standing up for people in their neighborhoods too, and street vendors themselves standing up for themselves, which is the Los Angeles street vending campaign, who I worked with for 6 years, that's what they did. So I had just heard major street vendor power.
Yeah, I had just heard, I don't know where I heard it, but that there was a group fundraising to buy pepper spray.
Yes.
For some of the street vendors to protect themselves. And I thought that was an interesting aspect. I mean, I'm not sure how useful it is if you're using your hands, cutting something or making a taco. Can you just pop out the pepper spray? I don't know. But I thought it was, like you said, there's major support and power, and there are groups that really support the vendors. I'm interested also in, I've heard when I bought fruit from some of the vendors that they have a patron or something that comes and they collect the carts. And sometimes I wonder a little more of that. I don't even know if we have time to talk about that, but it's just something to think about. Of,
yeah, it's interesting.
Like
what is that system like, Dr. Hidalgo? Because a lot of these people, like Adriana is saying, is, they're sort of working for a team, and they get dropped off and they get picked up. What is that dynamic? Right. And are they being exploited by those people?
Right. So that is this amazing work by Rocio Rosales, who looks at fruit vendors. And so every informal thing that you see out there in the world has a different set of rules, has its own sort of logic. And so what I'll say, this isn't exactly my expertise, but what I'll say about like fruit vendors and paleteros is that they are in that system of really not working for themselves the way that we think of, right? And so there has been, the work of Rocio Rosales, the work of Christian Zloninsky that talks about the paleteros, where it's like they are subject to some exploitation by the manager or the person that owns it, so that does happen. It is something that happens. And then some people do own their own, so it just depends on the fruit vendor. I don't really see that happening with like taco vendors, tamale vendors, pupusa vendors, but for some reason the logic of those two, paleteros and fruit vendors, operates under that kind of model. So
maybe it's the need, like fruit, you got to have constant fresh product coming through, and then with the paletas you got to freeze them, and then that's a whole thing, that's another process that perhaps is more involved than somebody who's just coming out and making hot dogs or making tacos. Talking about community
exploitation, capitalist workers. Once again, they know there's people, there's product, let's get them out there.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because, like, I think in her work, I read Rocio's work, I read that it's like a family in Mexico that basically, started this and has the
That's that Michoacan one. I see Michoacan everywhere. That's the one.
Yeah. So
the Michoacan paleteros. I want to get into the concept of abolitionist marketplaces, because you're talking about the alliances within the street vendors. So can you talk about the term that you coined and how you came up with this idea?
Right. Yeah. So I worked with the Los Angeles street vending campaign for 6 years, and I did so many interviews with them and talked to them over so much time. And then, I mean, years of interviews with the same people, and going with them to all these different places, and participant observation at the park and in their homes and on the sidewalk and in their organizing meetings. And so, then you sit down and you're looking at these transcripts and you're trying to make patterns and you're trying to sift through it. And what are they telling me? And I was really inspired by the work of Ruth Gilmore Wilson, and she is a Black feminist geographer and who talks about abolition quite a bit. And I was really, really inspired by Angela Davis. And the reason that I mention them is because when they talk about and when they're looking at abolition, they're looking at it in terms of the criminal justice system and prisons, right? But they're also able to connect that to other struggles, be it immigration, be it what's happening in Palestine, right? And so there's very expansive way of thinking of abolition. And so that was very much something I was thinking about. And then what's interesting about the LA Street Vending campaign, the majority were Latinos, and they created these alliances with Black women who were also street vendors. And so, I was trying to just make sense of this, but also what's interesting about the Latino street vending campaign is that they really focused on police. And a lot of times, like in our activist work as Latinos, we think immigration is the core issue that we have. And so they were really talking about their interactions with police. And so all of that kind of, had me thinking about abolition. And then also, abolitionist marketplaces, the term that I use was just spending so much time with them and seeing how, a lot of times we've talked about how, oh, these are small business owners, they're entrepreneurs, and in this way, it's kind of like, oh, this is the, American dream. It's in a way, it's a way of kind of trying to sanitize them and elevate them in a certain way. And what I saw when I was there and spending so much time with them was that in many ways, they're not operating from this individualistic model, right? They're very much in this mindset of communal. And I'll give you some examples of that. I would see a vendor who makes buttons, Jerry, she makes buttons, and she would, her friend Lady Bluesologist would come over and give her a book, and they would exchange money, and that book was something that she was going to use to make those pins. And so there's these exchanges that are happening amongst them, right, to create their art and to create what they're making. And the same thing happens with Latino street vendors. And it comes to sharing different types of food, or like having credit lines for people even. Sometimes they pay you back, sometimes they don't. Or hiring unhoused people in the community. And think about Mercedes. She's been working with the same man, Miguel, for 9 years. He's an unhoused person and living in Tent City. And so, there's just all these relationships of exchange that happen that don't fit within this kind of like individual sort of capitalist kind of way that we're thinking. They fit more within ideas of collectivity. Mm-hmm. And
interesting. So almost anti-capitalism. It's like a reaction to capitalism, how we can survive because capitalism wasn't working for them.
Right. And, it's in a way, there's some ways in which they do fit within. So for example, they're very politically savvy. And so they know what's going to appeal at City Hall. So they know how to position themselves and craft, themselves in a way that, helps them and the campaign ultimately. But what I'm talking more about is in practice. So what I see them doing in practice is very different, right? And so even unhoused people, the way that they would hire them to clean things for them or feed them, because they realize that the unhoused people are the ones that are cleaning the bathroom nearby, right? And so just this kind of ecosystem, if you want to think about it, that's what I think of as an abolitionist marketplace. And I'll say, so part of it is, there's the police component, and thinking about, abolishing this criminalization, abolishing these unjust laws. There's this communal kind of part of it. And then there's also this part where they're very much, when I've spoken with them, they're very much thinking about the way that street vending is going to help the future generation. And so they perceive, like, my daughter's here with me, she's learning the value of work. She's learning what it means to save money. She understands if she wants something, we can't right now. We're gonna have to save for it, and then I let her bring her things to come here and sell. And so then I've talked to vendors who are like, they're understanding that they can create something. And that's going to help them not just in school, but in all of their lives, that they can do something, right? And so the way that I see street vendors thinking about the practice of street vending is very visionary. It's very much about that what's happening right now isn't, we're working towards a different future, and they're doing that through their vending, right? They're doing that through trying to end these unjust laws, right? So, I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Are you finding that these vendors stay within that business? Like, if they have a small hot dog cart, is that their job for decades? Does it get passed to their families? Do they eventually move on to something else? Or is it pretty consistent?
Yeah, so a lot of the people that I work with, it's like a mother and her daughter, you know, and that's, I guess, a beautiful thing is that they're all like, so many of the people I work with, it's like 3 generations, all involved in vending and all involved in activism, the LA Street Vending Campaign.
Hold on,
You
let's
know,
let
so
Lena
you
get
have,
situated. Are you
oh,
okay,
yeah.
Lane?
No, sorry, my
Yeah, well, we were looking up your nostril a second ago. I was like, wow, this is getting graphic. Well, Dr. Hidalgo is talking about sort of the beauty of some of these vendors working alongside their children. Go ahead.
Just background sounds bother you guys?
No, you're totally fine. You're fine. Just your nostril. If we could get that out of the shot, then that would be. That's okay. We're, you know, this is how it is nowadays because of COVID. We have to, you know, we can't shoot in studio. We can't, you know, but we'll do our best. I had a leaf blower just outside. It's fine. I hear a slight beep. It's okay. Anyway, go on, Dr. Hidalgo.
No, I was just saying, you know, a lot of these things are intergenerational in a certain way. And, you know, and that's even in my family. Like, I'll tell you, like, my grandmother sold stationery and Bibles first from her home, then from a little stall on the sidewalk, and then a little tiendita. And I would always get on the bus and go with her when we were in El Salvador, and I would go and I would sell with her. And then same thing with my dad. When we moved to the US, my dad couldn't find any other kind of work. And so we sold CDs at events. We sold, we cleaned offices, and we sold, what else? We delivered newspapers. You know, we did it all, you know, and this is all part of the informal economy. So it got passed down from my grandmother to my father. And again, it's that situation. It's like, as human beings, it's human nature. You have children, you're going to survive. You're going to find a way. No matter what it is, you'll invent.
Sin pena.
It, you know?
Sin pena. You just do it.
Yeah.
And I feel like that there is something instilling this work ethic in kids when you have young kids out there working, you know, alongside their parents. There's a pride that some of these kids get, you know, I'm not talking about people that are exploiting their children, which we know happens as well.
Yeah.
But I'm talking about this idea, especially on the weekends. Sometimes you see the women selling flowers and they have their kids with them. They're having a little picnic there. There's something beautiful about that to me.
Right. Yes. And, you know, I found that too, like, Emira Estrada's work. She just came out with a book on this. She works with child street vendors, and her work is fascinating because she's working with this group, and she calls it economic empathy. So it's this thing that develops amongst child street vendors where they understand the situation intimately that their parents are in. And so they know exactly what the finances are. So they're not going to ask for things that they know their parents can't afford. And when they need their graduation caps and their graduation rings, they're willing to work the extra hours to make that happen, you know? And you know, a lot of them are doing well in school, you know? And so she kind of makes that case, you know, that it's, you know, we're not talking about exploitation here, but we're talking about the way in which young people actually, it's gives them values, right? And I found this very similar thing from the perspective of the parents, that they, you know, they really feel like not just the street vending, but the organizing that happens when you're street vending, right? The way that you walk to a corner and people aren't just set up randomly, right? There's rules that are operating. People know where they're allowed to set up, you know?
Right.
That's all happening through organizing. It's all happening through, you know, radically re-envisioning the sidewalk. And so that's, you know.
So there's territories. People know there's like, they have their own map and they know where everybody's at and they know whose corner's on it. And so what if somebody comes in and tries to get in on their territory? Is there like a turf war?
Yes, you get cussed out. And everybody talks about that. Everybody talks about whether you're a Black vendor or a Latino vendor. Everybody shares about when they were brand new and they showed up and they didn't know that there were rules. They didn't know there was a map. And they got cussed out. You know, that's what happens. You get cussed out. You know, it's very embarrassing. But then you learn, right? You learn, oh, okay, you know. And then they're like, and now if somebody comes to my spot, I'll cuss them out or get my friends to, right? So
like Santiago's old school, there were paletero, a woman who would come all the time and all the stuff. They're similar to what was talking about.
We're losing your audio a little bit.
Oh, so you're gonna
There
have to
you
see. You're gonna have to see my nostril again.
That's okay. We're used to it at this point.
Similar to those rules of, letting people have free elotes and then, paying back the next week. And then next thing you know, a guy comes, elotero comes, and he stations up right at that spot. And she, as a female, really couldn't go and cuss him out. So it got interesting. She ended up trying to get all the parents against him and to buy from her. And it was just an interesting dynamic. Like, she would be like, oh, ay, pobrecita, like, oh, I can't, why did he come? And she would just do like, we were backing her up. So it was interesting.
It worked.
Yeah. It was like, and it's like you're describing that was such a creative concept, Dr. Hidalgo, Leigh-Anna, about, I know, so
it's not weird for me at all. It feels natural.
Proud your accomplishments, but also it's so creative, this concept that you came up with, this abolitionist marketplace, because it really does position these people as in a really complex of systems. And like when you mentioned the idea of how they establish relationships with their customers, it really resonated with me, just with my experience, because and our local elotero also gives us free stuff, and we go and he doesn't even collect. We go and find him and we give the money. It's funny, we don't know each other's names. He just trusts us, and he shows that, and that makes us really want to give him back. Sometimes we just give him money when we're not even going to buy him stuff now. It's just like, it's interesting how that really connects with people, and how it creates
community. That's community.
Like any store that you would walk into, it's like,
right.
Well, it used to be. You used to be able to go to the general store and have a credit account, and you just would get what you needed, and they'd write it down. And then because of capitalism, I think we've gone so far away from that because of individualism, and so now it's like, no, I got to take care of me, and people are screwing me. But this idea of the collective, if we help each other, which is really, the basis of abolitionist marketplaces, if I'm understanding it correctly. But we are seeing, people like Adriana and the community kind of stepping forward and lining up after these street vendors get vandalized or get beat up, lining up. I remember over in the valley here in Los Angeles, it was like 100 people lining up to sell out this guy's little cart. I want to show you guys a video of a comedian who's making a joke of protect your street vendors or else is his thing. And he sort of dresses up as an ice cream truck guy. Check this out. It's really funny. This guy's name's Concrete. He's a Chicano comedian.
I can't hear it.
I can't hear it.
Yeah, we can't hear it. But its face is funny. I can't hear it. Larry, looking.
So this is the street vendors fighting back, right? Which, that doesn't really happen, but this is sort of like, watch out, if you get these guys, they're going to get you back. And then he has a follow-up where he's like pushing one of the carts with the little raspadas, or what do they call them? The little wagon wheels. And they're like, you're that guy in the ice cream. He's like, no, that's not me. And they catch him, and then he's running with his cart.
You had mentioned earlier about the Laker game, and anyone who's been to Laker game or probably elsewhere where they have the hot dog carts, the police came by, and oh my Lord, I have not seen a hot dog cart or any cart of any, except for a go-kart, move that fast. Like, like most of them were females, and you had mentioned in your work that a lot of these street vendors are females, but the only male that was in there flew the fastest. And I was like, man, I was just like, does he have like rollerblades on too? And he just, I mean, it's like he rode that thing down, and he was one of the got away. Remember
kind of yelling out to the police, hey, leave them alone. You know, they're just trying to make a living. And that's when, similar to Vivi's experience, the oranges, he turned around and just looked at me and like whispered, you don't know the stuff we've seen on those carts. And I'm like, what, rat? Like dead rats? I mean, how bad could it be?
Yeah, I've never gotten sick from a bacon wrapped hot dog when I ate them. I don't eat meat anymore, but I you know, are they unsanitary, Dr. Hidalgo? Are they dirty carts? Is there truth to that?
I don't think there is. I think that honestly, I feel much more comfortable eating from a street vendor than from a restaurant. Like honestly, like where you can see everything, like I feel like that's much cleaner than a restaurant where you don't see what's happening back there, you know? So I don't know. That's just me personally, you know, but I grew up eating this food. But yeah, I think that, I mean, very much what Adriana was saying, like this idea of sanitary and unsanitary, it's very racialized. Yeah. And it's very much based in class, you know? Yeah, yeah. And you talked about the Staples Center. So I just wanted to point out, or not the Staples Centers, but Lakers. Yeah. I wanted to talk about, it made me think about, you know, it's really important in this conversation to also think about who is opposing street vendors. And so in the 6 years that I would go to City Hall, these major business improvement districts like the Staples Centers, like, you know, people in suits who represent these huge corporations who don't want street vendors there. They want to replace it with something else, right? And so in this conversation, we really need to talk about gentrification because that's really what's going on here. That's really the reason why you see street vendors being displaced. You see the criminalization ramping up. And you can see that if you look at the areas where the most arrests happen, it happens in the neighborhoods that are undergoing this change, the change being gentrification, right? So MacArthur Park, Rampart Police Station had one of the highest arrests. Silver Lake, Echo Park, that whole area had the highest arrests, right? Highland Park.
Which we should mention for people outside of Los Angeles, was an area that was historically actually very dangerous, gang-ridden, very poor, and now has really been over, you know, what word am I thinking of? Undergoing a revitalization of the neighborhood, and a lot of people with money are coming in and buying those homes and gentrifying. But go ahead, Dr. Hidalgo, sorry.
Right. Yeah, so just to point out that money is at play, huge corporate, you know, huge corporations and money are at play here. And kind of like the trick, and this is where the rhetoric comes in, is that it's very easy to get a mom and pop small business owner, carniceria owner or something like that, to be the face or the front of that, and to pit them against street vendors, right? But let's be real about who's behind the money, and it's the business improvement districts, right? And so in that sense, I feel that, you know, it's kind of a trap, right? It's a way of setting up people from the same community even against each other, and not looking at the bigger picture, which is who stands to benefit from this. And it's not your carniceria owner, it's your, you know, huge corporation that's a real estate investment.
How weird. It's like a David and Goliath story. Like, it's so mind-boggling to me that something that big would find someone so small, you know, as a nuisance, you know, as a threat even. I want to ask you, as we only have about 10 more minutes left, but I want to talk to you about the recent legalization in Los Angeles, decriminalization, I should say, of street vending. What effect has that had, if any?
Yeah, so that was something that the LA Street Vending Campaign worked for a decade. And I want to say what's so huge, and this is to point out street vendor power, a decade of organizing, of getting on a bus with your child, with your grandchild, to have weekly, sometimes daily meetings, incredible work that they were able to do for the long term. And it's actually a statewide thing. They were able to take this all the way up to the governor to decriminalize street vending. So, so what does that mean in practice? So in January, they were supposed to be able to be given permits to vend, legal permits. Now, street vendors had always been buying permits. If you look at a lot of carts, you'll see that they have a permit there. They were paying for a permit that didn't hold any kind of protection. That didn't prevent police from being able to arrest them, right? So now the city is giving permits, but the permits are expensive, they're costly. So most of the vendors that I work with make around under $15,000 a year. And the permits were expensive for them. And also they weren't giving that many out. And so there wasn't a lot of, and also with this plan, there wasn't a lot of information given to street vendors. So in terms of education, in terms of getting the word out there, letting vendors know what's happening, there wasn't much information or money allocated to that, but most of the money was allocated to enforcement. So no longer police, now a team of people who work for, you know, this ordinance, you know, but still the same sort of pattern getting repeated. And what ended up happening was, you know, with everything happening around COVID, a lot of vendors who did get the permit still weren't able to vend. And you see, you know, it's not that I want vendors to be out there and getting sick. It's not that, but it's this double standard that you see with restaurants. Restaurants lobbied the city of LA to let them be on the sidewalk when they reopened, right? And they were allowed to do so. It happened overnight, not a problem. Whereas street vendors have been highly criminalized during this time, even with it being decriminalized, still getting fined for being out during quarantine, you know? So I think that, and it's not, for the LA street vending campaign, they're still mobilizing. Now they're getting behind cancel the rent campaign, right? And so it's never, they're not giving up. They're continuing to fight. They're continuing to bring up these issues. Yeah. I joined them for a caravan before I left LA, where they brought attention to this. They brought, they went to the Public Works Center, they went to LA City Hall, and they, you know, they did this amazing thing where they had a street vendor go and deliver a bill, basically being like, you've been summoned by the people because what you're doing is wrong, you know? Powerful. So it was very powerful. It was incredible, you know? So like, even in all this, even when it seems like hopeless and it seems like, wow, even though it's decriminalized, look what's still happening. I'm always encouraged by looking at the LA Street Vending campaign and the vendors I had the privilege of working with for 6 years, because they don't give up, you know? And we got to remember that when they get behind stuff like cancel the rent, right? Because they're the most marginalized, right. That's something that benefits all of us. Right. Everything that the street vendors do, right? Benefits all of us. When they're trying to get police to stop arresting people, that's a benefit to all of us, you know? Right. So I feel that I'm encouraged when I see, okay, people in the community are getting it and they're understanding, you know, that street vendors are where it's at.
Yeah. We had a question come in about whether or not food truck people get along with street vendors. Is there any conflict between them?
Yeah, so I'm in Los Angeles. I'm not really sure about this, but it's important to point out that street vendors are very different from the gourmet trucks, and lonchero trucks, which was a previous project that I did, are very different from gourmet food trucks, right? So there's different people of different races and classes that are operating those different things, right? And so because we live in a very flawed society, different regulations and laws apply to each of those. And so obviously the gourmet truck has ease, right? And is invited in to events. The lonchero truck, not so much. Like I know from LA, my husband did the LA marathon, you know? And it was so, this is LA for you, right? All the gorgeous gourmet trucks are in the LA marathon area, right? And go outside the line, and there's the lonchero trucks.
Wow.
Right? And so this is what, if you ever go to LA Marathon, do not buy from those gourmet trucks. Go outside the line and buy from the loncheros, because that's your people, you know? And so just always, I think it's important to have this consciousness, right? So that's just what I saw in LA. Yeah. But, you know, I recently read this work by Nina Martin in Chicago, and finding the very similar thing where the gourmet food trucks are like, you know, like elite, classy, arty, and it's all about gentrification, right?
Yeah, it is.
It's all connected, right?
Yeah.
Whereas the street vendor is your immigrant, it's your
They're
Black,
colonizing
Latino,
street vendors.
it's your disabled person, right? That's the street vendor, right?
Yeah.
And so the laws are just shaped again to, make it harder for them.
What's happening? You mentioned a little bit of some of them being penalized during quarantine for being out and about, but what is happening to them during COVID and the pandemic? Because nobody's on the streets.
Mm-hmm.
So how are these people making money? How are they making ends meet at this point? There are not resources for them. They do not qualify for unemployment. They don't qualify for small business loans. What are they doing at this point?
Right. So there's been a lot of fundraising that's been happening. So Inclusive Action for the City is one of these that has been doing a lot of fundraising. The LA Street Vending Campaign itself has been doing a lot of fundraising, and they've been distributing food. So a lot of mutual aid is what's been happening. Yeah. So the nonprofits have been doing that. Also, there's smaller mutual aids that are not run by nonprofits. So People for People LA, which I was volunteering for a short period of time. So it's really been like that, like mutual aid. And this is where the Abolitionist Marketplace, I believe, is really key, right? Those relationships that have been built with each other, with people in the community, and with other people. But the situation's dire. I'm really worried about a lot of the street vendors that I work with, and I'm constantly checking in on them because some of them are diabetic, some of them have heart conditions, some of them have a leg that's injured that can't walk, So when you're thinking about like food and it's really scary, right? When people are relying on donations and they're relying on the food bank and things like that, So this is really a troubling time for street vendors. And I'm just amazed that they continue to rise to the challenge and continue to organize around canceling the rent, but it is something I'm afraid of, and it is something that
so
I'm
much intersectionality with all of these issues.
Right.
So you've mentioned the LA Street Vending Campaign. Is that a way that we can then support our local street vendors by donating to something like that? Do all communities have a mobilizing group like that, or how do we find them?
Yeah, so the LA Street Vending Campaign is now called VEA, Vendedores en Acción. And so also Inclusive Action for the City, if you want to like donate to street vendors, they've been doing a lot of delivering food to street vendors. And just if you know of a street vendor or you see a street vendor out there, just, you can always help them. And buy from them. And so those are the two main ways that in LA specifically that I would look into.
Adriana, do you have any final thoughts on the conversation?
No, I mean, just with everything we talk about, you just start thinking of your own experiences.
Right.
Not only the informal, workers like you were talking about but also with just how these different cities start their attack on street vendors for different reasons. Our city, I live, Whittier, I want to say a couple of years ago, it was a real harsh attack on street vendors that they were because we have a lot of taco trucks in Whittier that have probably come from East LA and have way down from Whittier Boulevard because there's maybe a surplus in East LA, I don't know. But the trucks, and we have tons of taco trucks.
Maybe they're meeting the need, though. Maybe they're coming there because they know,
Really interesting to see how every single truck has like their clientele, and we used to switch from truck to truck, and it's just but I think a portion of the population was surprised at how it just exploded within the last years, that they really started to put up a stink in city council and through the media. So it's just interesting to put context to those reactions, for anyone who's watching this and that could relate, oh yeah, my city did that, or I've heard those sentiments. It's good to be able to think about it in the way that you're framing it. and it's a very complicated thing. And like you said, they're filling the need. There's people buying tacos. I mean, there's 20 taco trucks, and each one has a different spice or a different type of tortilla or different salsas, which I prefer, you know, my red salsa or whatever it is. It's how a taco could be made in 70 different ways, you know, or whatever it is.
Infinite combinations.
Yeah.
Right.
Dr. Hidalgo, I know you're going to be, you're working on authoring a book about abolitionist marketplaces. When can we see that hit the market?
I'm
Please.
hoping.
No pressure.
Hoping in 2022.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then
so
I know
that's my goal.
you also had a lot of interest in researching more about the history of street vending. What sort of things are you going to be looking at when you explore that?
Yeah, so I see that as a future project, is really adding sort of a historicity to this conversation, you know. So I want to actually go back to those early Chinese street peddlers, and, you know, I want to look at Los Angeles, Mexican vendors, Central American vendors, Black vendors, but when we didn't call them vendors, when we called them peddlers, right? And I want to look at those arrest records, and I want to look at those early mobilizations, because I think it's very important to add that this is history, you know, and that's why I appreciate this conversation, because we started there, you know, and this isn't a new thing. People like to act like this is a new thing. This is not a new thing. This has always existed, because this system, you know, that, you know, this capitalist system, imperialism, you know, controlling people's bodies, controlling what people can produce, has always existed. And so people have always found ways around that. That's where the abolitionist part comes in too, right? To try to live and be free and hoping for a better future, right? That's always existed. And I feel like we need to understand that when we're having these conversations about street vendors today, is to understand the history of that.
Well, Dr. Hidalgo, thank you so much for your insight on this. It's been really eye-opening. I've learned a lot. How can people follow you, follow your research? Are you on socials, or is there a website?
Yeah, so you can follow my website, Leigh-Anna Hidalgo, Leighana, Hidalgo, HIDALGO.com. And you can see my work, the different kinds of visual projects that I've done, and also some of my students' work.
Incredible. And thank you, Adriana. I really appreciate your nostrils and your insight into the conversation. I hope you're having a good time at the beach.
I love you, and I miss seeing you, and I love even your nostrils.
As do I. Dr. Hidalgo, I also want to invite you back because I know you've also done some work with body image. And so hopefully we can have you come back and talk about that another time.
Ooh, I'd love to. That's another one of my favorite conversations.
I love it. I love it. Thank you again, Chicana Power. I appreciate all the insight, ladies. And thank you for contextualizing it for me.
Have a great day. Thank you so much for inviting us.
Bye, guys.
Bye.